Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast.
So we're talking with Dana Lockhart, who is the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Lexington, Kentucky. So Dana, you alluded to something that I think it's really key in the fact of now you have an opportunity to talk to massive amounts of people. And, growing up, watching church, it was usually, reserved for the televangelists, the people that had the big church, that had the big TV cameras. And if you want like Billy Graham, you could see Billy Graham anywhere because he had the big church. He had all of that working for him. So you as the pastor, you now have this opportunity because you have, whether we're still in the pandemic and you only have your 10 people in the building with you, or we're starting to come out of it and you have more people coming in, but you have this opportunity to speak truth to power when it comes to God and religion. How does it change the way you write a sermon or you give a sermon? Because now you have not only your audience in the sanctuary with you, but now you have a virtual audience of people who may have different understandings of religion, of your faith, of God in general. How do you tailor your message to a bigger audience, a broader audience, a hypothetical audience that you may never hear from, may never see, may never know if they got the message the way it was intended to be given to them?
Yeah.
It's a big question, and obviously there's probably not a good answer to that, but that's just in your head, because you're the one who's every Sunday putting a word out there. How do you, as you go through your process, has your process changed? Does your process still basically kind of stay the same? How do you navigate those waters?
So this is something I've given a lot of thought to. So I'm going to try not to just talk and ramble, but to try to lift up some cogent thoughts, and hopefully I'll succeed. Preaching to an iPad is a completely different experience to preaching to a congregation. In that was one of the immediate stressors as someone who preaches, is when I'm in front of a congregation, I can see the people that are the primary, and I don't want to say audience, because I think audience is kind of the wrong word for what happens in a sermon. The preacher and the congregation together make the sermon, and there's feedback and there's energy in the room, and there's moments where there's affirmation, or there might be moments where there's dissent, and all of that's palpable in a when you're in a pulpit, and there are people who are physically present, and there's humor and there's drama, and it's very communal. And having had the experience of serving like 4 little churches in South Dakota, and I'd give the quote unquote same sermon 4 different times, but it was actually 4 different sermons. And it was the same manuscript, it was the same preacher, but it was 4 different times of day, 4 different communities. All of these things shape what actually makes a sermon. And as someone who's drawn to preaching, I love the sermon as an art form, in that it has a life of its own. It begins and it ends. And it felt, and still does feel, somewhat artificial to record that, because so much of what actually happens in the encounter of someone who is standing in a pulpit or in a church trying to interpret scriptures in the context of a local community in a way that communicates a message of God's word, right? Like, that's a heavy responsibility. And there's so much that goes into it that you can't just record and replicate. And so I don't have a good answer to the question of like whether recorded sermons aren't something different from in-person sermons. To me, the whole art of preaching right now is going through this. We're having to think through the implications. As a beginning preacher and as a preacher today, I actually love the idea of sermons not being recorded, because then it's a moment in time. It's an event. It's something that happens. It's not just another speech or another lecture. It's an event. It's something that happens that can't be replicated. And then all of a sudden we had to find out a way. Okay, so if that's not possible, what's the next best thing? And that was virtual sermons. So preaching in front of an iPad with no one present was tremendously difficult. And then preaching to a congregation that was scattered because there's no feedback. You don't know if what you're saying is connecting with anybody. You don't know if the humor you try to include is resonating. You don't know if the kind of the hard truth that you're trying to get out there, whether or not that's landing. All of that is gone. And so the whole relationship between preacher and congregation was dramatically altered. And that was very difficult in the creative process. Suddenly I have to completely change what I'm doing because I'm going to get zero feedback while it's happening. It's no longer an event. It's something that gets recorded and then viewed, remotely and not even at the same time. So
Augustine, I can imagine too now people are watching your sermon and they're watching 4 or 5 other sermons and they're comparison, what you said was great, but I like the sermon of the church that I saw that's down the street or somewhere else, because now rather than being, locked into your church on Sunday and hearing only your sermon and maybe somebody else telling them about another preacher's sermon, they now have the ability to watch your sermon and say, well, I like his message. We're talking about Revelations, but then Pastor down the street's also talking about Revelations. What's the comparison? How's that pastor doing versus yours? So I can imagine that's also got to be a stressor, or, maybe to some degree in your thought process as well.
Oh yeah. And like my mom does that, right? Because like my mom, I love my mom. She's attending another congregation, and our 2 churches use the same lectionary. So it's the same reading. So like when she's at her church with her priest, it's the same readings that we're using at my church. And so she'll call me up like every Sunday and compare the 2 sermons, which I think is useful. You're sort of like, well, Father Mark said this, and then, but I liked how you did that. And I'm like, they were very different, but they were both good. And because like, what else is a mom going to say? Right. But like that brings it home that is happening. One of the unrealized promises of virtual ministry, at least in my experience, was the opportunity to do 2-way engagement. That I had more hope that some of that would develop, that we could, particularly when we put in a tech booth, that we could have like a second person live tweeting or live chatting with people, so that we could kind of rebuild some of that 2-way feedback. That hasn't worked in either of the 2 congregations that I've served that are doing live stream every Sunday. That might be a technological step too far or too fast. And also that you have the problem of it's hard enough in a lot of congregations finding one person to run the tech every Sunday versus now all of a sudden needing 2. But there was hope for some engagement back and forth through social media And then that opens the question of, is that a good thing? Like, I thought it was a good thing because I was desperate for some kind of feedback in the early days of the pandemic, some kind of two-way engagement. But I was working with a deacon who was a very faithful person. And like, we would have these long conversations, me and Deacon Emily, about should we have the comments on at all during a live stream service? Because, you know, is that helpful or is it not? And there are different points of view on that. But that is another thing, right? You preach in a congregation and someone doesn't like your sermon, and maybe they say something to you, maybe they say something to Sally in the next pew. But like, now you're putting it out online. And so there's always the potential that anything you say or do can go viral, which also adds to the stress and the tension of everything. Because do you take risks in your preaching, or do you avoid those? Because suddenly the element of risk is much higher than it was before. I mean, like, I'm a priest who serves under accountability. Everything I've done in worship since the pandemic is recorded, you know, which means like before, someone could get kind of angry and, you know, send an email or a letter to the bishop. And now not only can they send a letter or an email to the bishop, they could be like, look at what he said. Right? and so that part is there. Being compared is there. The other thing, and this is something that is underappreciated, is like, we're watching it right now in social media in the church. There was a United Church of Christ pastor who was just writing something and wrote out the Apostles' Creed, and it auto-corrected to Sparkle Creed, right? And so this pastor is like, oh, well, what would it look like to write a Sparkle Creed? And writes a Sparkle Creed. And which is all about being inclusive, and particularly was written for with the Pride Month in mind, and was kind of a rephrasing of Christian teachings in a way that would be very inclusive of LGBTQ people. And then there's a pastor, and an ELCA pastor, so my church denomination in Minnesota, who uses this in worship, which we can debate whether that's a smart idea or not. But she uses it in her local congregation in worship. Well, before the pandemic, you know, this kind of stuff would happen. But since then, so they use it in worship, and then the pastor loads it to TikTok and it goes viral. And so suddenly, what happens in, you know, one pastor in one church in one denomination creates something, it gets shared. And then a pastor in another denomination takes that, uses it, and then broadcasts it. And then all of a sudden, I'm in conversation with people in Lexington, Kentucky, based off of what happened in worship, you know, a month ago in a congregation in Minnesota, which was based off of a reflection written by a pastor in another denomination somewhere else in the country beforehand.
Wow.
And so the ability for what's happening in a local context to go viral, and then to have that then impact, because not everyone's a fan of the Sparkle Creed. Not everyone thinks it should be used in worship. Some people would say it's heretical. Like, these debates suddenly rage, but we're debating what local communities are deciding, but it's no longer confined to those local communities. And so that's introduced a whole new element of things. And also, like, pastors have egos. They do, like we do. And there's a real sinful temptation in the idea that suddenly I can reach a bigger audience. that suddenly I can be a bigger and more important voice within the church. And suddenly, how do I grow that audience? And of course, one of the ways in which you can grow that audience in the age of social media is to be particularly provocative. And I'm watching that happen. I've watched that happen through the whole pandemic. And I've tried very hard myself not to go in that route, but I understand the temptation because now there's so much content being produced. And all of a sudden, if you had 10,000 mediocre sermons that were delivered in 10,000 local congregations, that they went no further than that. But now, it's you're trying to get your sermon out there in a sea of tens of thousands of other sermons, and most of them are not particularly notable. So then there's this temptation to like, how do I then attract eyeballs? How do I then attract viewers, build an audience? And one way to do that is to be really, really, really good. And then the other temptation is to use shortcuts. Like, now's the opportunity for me to climb on top of my hobby horse and really be provocative. And I don't think that's helpful for the church. I don't think that's helpful for communication. But I'm definitely kind of seeing that. And you see it from the other standpoint. I mean, there's a lot of of churches with very different theology than mine. We're also putting content out there. And that content out there is often pushing the envelope in different directions of less tolerance, of less inclusion, of calling people out. And what's lost in all of this, of course, is the context of this is all supposed to be happening within a community with reciprocal relationships. The beauty of the pastor standing in a pulpit with a local congregation is I'm not trying to outrage or get 100 likes from people that I'll never meet. I'm talking to a community that I know and that I'm accountable to. And if I hurt someone's feelings, that person could come and talk to me, and I have to have a person-to-person conversation with them and understand the hurt that was caused, and then reflect on, is that a valid reflection of, like, did I do something wrong? And then invite them to reflect on, did they hear something that might have been painful, but that they needed to hear? And that whole human side of it, that whole pastoral side of it, is in danger of being lost if your only emphasis is on getting content out there that will register with the algorithms and that will produce a lot of shares or a lot of likes or a lot of hate views. So
that makes sense. And I feel like what you said, it just now dawns on me that there are a lot of provocative, whether it be sermons or provocative pastors who maybe have always wanted that spotlight, and now this gives them an easy way to it. So, I mean, it hits with what you say. We're with Dana Lockhart, who's the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Lexington, Kentucky. So, Dana, now that we're out of the pandemic is more or less in our rearview mirror. Have you seen your membership return to its normal levels? Has it still been kind of that split hybrid? And for those who haven't come back, have they given any reasons why? It's because of the convenience. Is it because of church hurt? I just would rather be at home. What have you experienced in the kind of reopening of church?
Right. So the breadth of experience and feedback for me, just, having pastored now, I'm second congregation. Faith is a little bigger than St. John's, but they're very comparable. I don't think either congregation has returned to its full worship numbers before the pandemic. There's still a sizable contingent of people who are viewing online or aren't comfortable coming in person, even now. And so we've recovered. We're probably about 70 to 80% of our in-person worship of what it was before the pandemic, which is actually pretty good. And we're still seeing, 20 to 30% of our Sunday attendance occurring online or virtual. That opens up lots of questions like, are they comparable experiences? There's a great theological debate about things like online communion. Can you consecrate communion virtually? That stuff's playing out in the church as well. Are there things that can only happen in person? And what do you do about them? Like communion has been one where there are some pastors who have encouraged people to have bread and wine at home that could then be consecrated. I have not. I have some theological questions about that, but no one's tried to do that necessarily with baptism. So, like, how do you do a virtual baptism? That's actually been less of an issue because I think it poses more practical and logistical challenges. And so, one of the things after the pandemic is, what does this look like going forward? Because for a while there, we had two tracks. Like, we had the people who were comfortable coming in person, we had the people who were comfortable online. Well, is that now a permanent feature of congregations everywhere, where you have in-person worshipers and you have online worshipers? And some people might swap back and forth. Some people might miss a Sunday and then watch it online. Some people might be primarily online for convenience or job's sake. Or scheduling challenges, but then duck in for particular services or particular rites. But it does seem like there is now a contingent of people who are exclusively in person, like they were before the pandemic, and still a contingent of people who are exclusively online. So how long does that continue, and how do we accommodate and pastor all of those people is something that I think is still being worked out. I think the initial viral numbers of the early pandemic have faded in most congregations. Just as life has returned to normal, there aren't as many people just sitting at home looking for a church service to watch. That's not to say that it's not to say that there aren't people still out there checking out different churches. I just think it's shifted now. Now what I'm finding is when someone shows up in person to visit my congregation, they've probably already watched 2, 3, 4, 5 services online to check us out and to see if we're a place that they want to be. And so now that's also developing online churches as an entry point to greater congregational membership. And instead of like church shopping, which happened before the pandemic, where you'd go and you'd visit 4 or 5 congregations, now you can do that virtually. And then by the time you show up in person, you have a sense of this congregation may be a good fit for me already. So these are all things that are changing, that are new realities that we're kind of parsing out, and are going to be with us for a long time.
And so now, like, for example, my church, we were talking beforehand, we've just added 2 new members in from Atlanta, live there, watch us virtually, and that's how they get our message. They came up, they were baptized at our church, but they live in Atlanta. We will not see them every week. We will only see them through the virtual means, whether they watch us live or whether they watch us on replay on YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And so we're looking at what does that mean in terms of our bylaws? They're members because they were baptized and they made their confession. They want to be members of our church. How do you guys, or have you guys had those conversations about, let's say somebody lives in California, but they want to be a member of your church in Lexington? Has the diocese said, okay, here's what the parameters are, because they pay their tithes, they are consistently online watching? Have you guys navigated those waters yet? And if so, what does that look like? Or is that more of a case by case basis?
Yeah, that's been fascinating. So like from my standpoint, so I understand the business and the governance and the institutional realities of the church. They're not my favorite part of the church, but I understand them. And churches tend to want to keep accurate records and have numbers and have statistics and have reports. And so you need a way to quantify things. And that's really been kind of hit and miss through the whole pandemic, because it takes time for bylaws to get adjusted. It takes time for canons or for constitutions or kind of judicatory guidelines to all get changed. And so the first standpoint is this is all new. And so one of the first questions in 2021 is, in the Episcopal Church, you and in the Lutheran Church, you file parochial reports. This reflects the whole year, and you file them with the national church, and they keep these records and are then able to attract attendance, giving, baptisms, communions, church services. All of these things that happen over the course of the year are then combined to produce national statistics. So, early 2021, and most churches have been closed for part or most of the preceding year. How then do you account for church attendance? And there were all of these various formulas that were produced. Because like views are a really weird thing. Like, how long are the views? How long do you have to watch the service to count as being in attendance?
Absolutely, yeah.
What do you do? Because like right now, you're in front of a computer, I'm in front of a computer. There's two people here. But like, if this were a church service, I could have my wife and my daughter here. So does that view count as one person or three people?
Right.
And so the Episcopal Church, I think, wisely decided that for its 2020 numbers, it would only count the services before the pandemic, because that just made the most sense.
Yeah.
The ELC, so like when we turned in that report, it only represented January and February, and I think one Sunday in March was included for the attendance figures, and those were then kind of extrapolated for the whole year. The ELCA tried to come up with formulas that different congregations produced, but then that's also the problem of again, pastors having egos. Like there is kind of this temptation sometimes to like juke the stats, right? And I think a lot of people were so looking for positive information or something positive to come out of this experience that when you go from in-person attendance, which is easily quantifiable, but also you can pad the numbers with that as well, to online attendance, which is impossible to quantify accurately, you could definitely pad the numbers.
Right.
And so the challenge that we have right now is what do you do about congregations that reported explosive growth in online attendance, but now how much of that was actually real? How much of it was temporary? And, I think situations like your church are the best case scenario of kind of this remote virtual congregation, in that these people in these new members in Atlanta, they did come up. People do know them. Their names and their information are known. And I think as your church navigates and my church navigates that reality, we're going to see that that's probably something that's going to be ongoing, and it will take time to sort of figure out what it means to be an online member of a congregation and how to incorporate those people into church governance. But it's going to have to be in a way that I think involves actual relationships, because you can have online, you can have real relationships online. But the challenge is always going to be, how do we avoid those instances where it's like, oh yeah, well, we really have 200 virtual members and no one knows who they are. No one knows their names. We're looking on YouTube and we're getting 10,000 hits, and we're not going to dig into the metrics deeper and find out how many of those last longer than 10 seconds, right?
Are they watching the sermon? Are they listening to the music? Do they cut it off when you start preaching? They cut you off. They just came for the music, or they came for the ceremony. What parts are they actually paying attention to?
Right. And how do you develop accountability measures? So like I will say I've got some online members now who will email or comment or will somewhat check in online on a regular basis, so that I and other people at the church know, I actually watched the service and participated in it remotely, and we know who those people are. And I think that's the direction that ultimately it's going to go. We're going to move away from, we're broadcasters that are reaching countless eyeballs, more towards we're developing authentic online relationships with people. There's email, there's text, there's comments, there are ways in which it's a two-way connection. I really feel like that's the challenge of virtual ministry going forward, is how to restore person-to-person relationships mediated through technology. And that's the underdeveloped side of things from my point of view with virtual ministry right now.
And so let me ask you this, kind of based off of that, off of relationships, and you're much like a in-person congregation kind of creates itself. Your online creation will happen as well. You mentioned the business of church when it comes to offering and the financials, because generally when people come to church, they give, and it's an immediate, they're putting the money in the collection plate. It's coming, it's consistent because their membership is consistent. If you have members flying in and out through social media, through watching a live stream, you may get people who are actually part of your congregation that aren't giving because they're not physically engaged, but then you may have somebody who lives elsewhere who is giving to your ministry, to your church. Have you seen any changes in that? Are there thoughts on how do we, because the ultimate goal is to keep the doors of the church open. And if more people are outside and they're not giving, or they're not giving at the consistency that they used to because they're kind of moving around, how do you all look at that? How do you deal with those, that new world?
Right. Well, and in the early days of the pandemic, I mean, it was frightening because traditionally what you're talking about is that giving tracks attendance. Yeah. And there have been ways to kind of smooth that out. And there are ways in which congregations had adapted different stewardship strategies. But in every congregation I've served, like when you map out giving through the year, you've got these peaks at Christmas and Easter, that are right along with the peaks in attendance. And then you've got these lulls in the summer. So all summer long, you're going to be in a deficit, but you'll make it up as you'll get a bump in the spring with Easter. There'll be somewhat of a deficit through the summer, and then you'll make it up before the end of the year at Christmas. And that's the business cycle of the church. It tracks attendance. And, one congregation I was part of in Ohio when I was in seminary, they had to cancel worship because of a snowstorm. And they then created this second offering, because what they found out was they had to take a special offering to make up for the Sunday that they lost, because people were used to giving every week what they gave. And if they didn't take up a special offering and make a point of that, then they were going to lose, their 1/50th of their annual giving, and that people wouldn't make it up. And so initially there was a lot of fear of, if people are not coming, do they still give? I think what most congregations found is that the giving really, the two congregations I've been associated with during this time, people continued to give very generously, even when they weren't attending in person. And thank God that they did, because otherwise we would have been in a world of hurt and wouldn't have been able to offer the technology upgrades and maintain the staff and do the programming that we did. I think with technology, there's some promise in online giving. One of the fascinating conversations that I've had, and I don't know how I feel about this. Again, I feel like that kid in the room who's saying something and everyone's looking at me like, what is this kid even talking about? But, I had raised the question of, if we grow actually an audience, is there a potential to monetize our YouTube stream, for instance?
Yeah.
Is that a way to capture some church revenue? And that one hasn't gone anywhere. I think that idea is still too weird or too out there. And I'm not even sure if it's a good idea, but it is an idea, right? I mean, That's how a lot of people who are doing, and that comes back to, are we content producers? Are we, are we looking to develop the audience the same way like an Instagram influencer would, or a YouTube channel develops an audience? I mean, there are people who do this professionally. Are we looking to replicate that? You mentioned televangelists earlier. I feel like from my corner of the church, we thought that television was so déclassé that we didn't really invest in it. Well, it turns out there's actually this huge market of people out there that wanted religious programming. And because we didn't get our particular theological stance out there, it's monopolized by different types of religions or different religious perspectives than ours. And so now the question is, so I serve in a liberal mainline denomination. Like, does social media present the opportunity for us to make up for the fact that we didn't really take televangelism seriously? Is what we're seeing online with social media the 21st century equivalent of what happened with television and radio in the 20th century? And what is the future for religious content on these platforms? And how do you then make money and support? And to a certain extent, like, your average small congregation isn't really equipped for this. So we're just in a state of flux. We're really in a state of flux, and really relying on the faithfulness of core groups of congregations to sustain the ministry of the church. And that's going to pose some challenges going forward if we don't also create other ways of funding ministry, either through online giving, through encouraging people who are participating remotely to online to give through credit card or bank draft or something. Or if we don't find a way to monetize the virtual ministry part of it. And, even saying that makes me feel a little icky, but it is the reality of the church where I'm serving. I mean, it's the reality, I think, of every ministry of how do we sustain this, and what new challenges and opportunities does it present to us?
Absolutely. So now, as we begin to wrap up, got a couple more questions for you. Looking at, obviously, the expansive history of religion, and seeing in the past few years, there's been articles about the decline of religion in what people are, going to church in person, the decline of people putting religion as part of what they do when they get up in the morning and go about their day. Do you think that obviously the pandemic was not something that any of us wanted or any of us expected, but it almost hit a reset, and it became, and with there now being this virtual piece, this hybrid piece of religion now, it's maybe, you could say this is either one of the most transformational times of religion, or this is maybe something that has or will allow religion to stay relevant long beyond what maybe people thought it was, or what it had. In some ways, I don't want to be demeaning to religion, because I think religion is so important, but been relegated to in our daily lives, if that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of things going on, and that was, the pandemic didn't come at the high point of American Christianity, right?
Right.
The decade, from 2010 to 2020, so 99 or 95% of that was pre-pandemic, saw some of the most dramatic declines in religious affiliation and religious attendance, that have ever been tracked. I mean, I think overall, the church, and not just the church, but I think most faith communities of all stripes, flavors, creeds, are experiencing the secularization of American society, and that poses challenges. I'm not exactly in a growth industry, and there's always hope that your local congregation can beat the odds, can beat the trends. And, to some extent, places I've served have been successful in that. And I think so now it's like the real question I have right now, and I don't have an answer for you, Ryan. Like, I really don't. When we look back, looking at what happens between 2010 and 2020, I don't know what the story is going to be like when we're looking back from 2020 to 2030. Is this a reset? Did this pause or lead to some growth, or did it accelerate the decline and or the trends of the trends that are leading a lot of places to decline? My fear, I mean, this was a frustration for mine early on in the pandemic. My Episcopal bishop, Mark Vancouvering, who is one of the most, I just want to say, I served under Mark. He's one of the most godly people, one of the most compassionate, pastoral, theologically serious church leaders I've ever worked with. Love the man. But at one point, he talked about how the most dangerous places in the pandemic were prisons, nursing homes, slaughterhouses, and churches. And I was
wow.
I was like, Bishop Mark, that's not good PR.
No.
statistically it was true. Like at the time he said that, these were areas that public health officials were identifying as particular risk vectors, right? And that there were things about being in those communities or in those activities that presented unique risks for transmission. So like what he said and why he said it, he was trying to keep people safe, trying to avoid the unnecessary loss of life. I totally understand it. But from a marketing standpoint, I was like, can we not say, I don't know, movie theaters, restaurants, and cruise ships and churches, right? Where people actually want to be, actually want to go, actually. And I wonder and I worry what the legacy of being identified as a particularly dangerous activity will impact church participation going forward. Because if in 2023 people still aren't comfortable coming back to in-person church services for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to judge those reasons. What happens if we have a bad flu season in 2026? Like, do we suddenly see, again, a real dip in in-person numbers? Are there things like, how long does that message that we cannot gather in person because worshiping together is not safe, which was emphasized differently in different religious communities, but definitely was a message that was out there during the pandemic? What lasting impact does that have? And I don't think any of us can predict that. Is this something that accelerates decline? Is the move to online worship kind of throwing a life raft to the church? I mean, it was a blessing in that it required a lot of innovation and a real entrepreneurial spirit, and it forced us out of old modes and old methods. It really forced every congregation not to be content with what was happening inside its own walls, because at the time, nothing was happening inside its own walls. So does that yield good fruit? Does it? I don't know. I mean, I wish I had a smarter, better answer for you, but I don't know. I'm in the midst of it. And I can see it going a couple of different ways. I'm definitely hopeful. But I don't know what the lasting impact of the pandemic is going to be.
Makes sense. So you've kind of alluded to it, but last question. Do you in your line of sight, because there's so many unknowns, if another pandemic were to come through, or another, like I said, flu season, or the proliferation of religion changes course, do you see brick and mortar churches becoming obsolete and a majority of our religious experiences being online, where people are either pop churches that are currently brick and mortar becoming strictly online, saying, we can sell our building, we can do the exact same things, or what we've been conditioning our parishioners to do online, or people saying, I don't need to have a brick and mortar building to have a church, because we talk in the Bible about church without walls. We can be a church and literally have our services at home. If we want to get together and have a community event, we can do it. We can rent a space, couple $100, whatever, and have our event, or do it outside, have an outside service. But we don't need the traditional brick and mortar, because that now it becomes obsolete. It becomes a convenience we don't necessarily need. Do you see that maybe being one way the church goes, or do you think there will always be a need for physical embodiments of the church and religion and what we've always come to know as being part of the religious experience?
So I think about 80 different things are going to happen, and it'll just depend on how successful they are. I think one of the scary things and one of the hopeful things is that there is no answer. There's no strategy. There's no church growth book. There's no program that you can buy off the shelf from a religious publishing house that could be implemented anywhere and is going to work. Every local faith community is going to have to discern its own mission and in its own context and then make judicious decisions. And the scary part about that is what if you choose the wrong thing, right? So I do think ultimately we're going to see brick and mortar churches, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are going to close. And I think if you go to major urban centers in the country and also rural churches close and they kind of become abandoned and or their cemeteries are maintained. But the church itself, the church building, if it's anything, it's there kind of as a monument. In urban settings, I mean, I was in Cincinnati not too long ago, and there was this big, beautiful brick church that had been turned into an Urban Outfitters, right? Like there are two old church buildings next door to my current church. One's a Buddhist prayer or meditation, Buddhist meditation society, and one is a dance studio, right? I mean, there is this sense in which local congregations are going to have to discern mission, and not everyone's going to get it figured out, and that's a scary and anxiety-producing thing. I do think adaptability is going to be a key test. Because there were also very loud, extremely insistent voices that the pandemic is coming to an end, or that it has ended, or that it was all overblown to begin with. And we should go back to pre-pandemic time and pre-pandemic reality as fast as possible and not embrace or maintain or sustain any changes. And that's out there too. And I've come up against that. I don't think it's realistic. Like, I don't think anyone can turn back the clock to 2019. And I don't know why you'd want to be honest with you. It wasn't like, 2019 or 2015 or 2010 was this magical era in the life of the church. And we should all long to go back to that. And even if an individual thinks that, well, it's impossible. So what do we do going forward? The one thing I can say is the church, for all of its reputation of being in decline, did demonstrate in the pandemic a remarkable resiliency. For all of its reputation for being stuck in its ways, did demonstrate a remarkable ability to adapt and then also be creative. And so my prayer would be for religious communities to grow out of this experience and to imagine ways of doing things that might not be the way that they're doing them right now. I don't think a virtual experience can replace an in-person experience in all regards. But I might not be right about that. I mean, at the end of the day, historians 300 years from now are going to talk about the internet the way we talk about Gutenberg and the printing press. Like, it is unleashing changes that we're living through, but they're all happening, and we're not exactly sure what they're all going to be because we're caught in the middle of it. I mean, just like Gutenberg probably, when he was figuring out how to print the Bible, didn't imagine that his actions were going to lead to a major religious reformation in Europe and this giant new commercial industry of publishing and all of this ways in which information can be quickly and affordably disseminated across wide swaths of territory, right? He had an invention. Well, we've only had this communication technology for a few decades now. Like, in the span of human history, this is a blip in time, and we're still in the middle of it. So I don't want to say, hey, 50 years from now, the majority of people will be attending worship in the metaverse, or that would never happen. Like, honestly, I didn't think that everyone would want a cell phone back in the day. I can remember being skeptical of that. I mean, there's a lot of things that I feel like, as a digital native, as a millennial, I've been ahead of the curve. But there's a lot of things that have developed that have surprised me. And I imagine that's going to continue to be the case.
I think that's probably about the best answer you can give, because we just don't know. We've been talking with Dana Lockhart, the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Dana, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This has been very, very interesting. And, it's always good to hear perspectives from people who have gone through the trenches, who are still trying to figure it out. And the fact that you've been very, very open about the fact that a lot of this you're still figuring out as you go. So, thank you so much, Dana.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. Take care and be blessed.